Welcome to the Napa Legal Podcast. I'm Frank DeVito, Senior Counsel and Director of Content at Napa Legal. And you're listening to the Napa Legal Weekly Podcast, where we explore religious liberty from the perspective of faith-based nonprofits. This week, we have an exciting special episode where we're joined by our guest, Nathan Berkeley, who's Associate Vice President for U.S. Strategies and Communications at the Religious Freedom Institute. Nathan has a wealth of experience in government and communications, as well as research and scholarship on religious liberty issues, the exact kind of things that we cover here on this podcast and at Napa Legal. Nathan's work at the Religious Freedom Institute in particular has led to deep engagement with the issue of physician-assisted suicide, which we've covered on the podcast in recent weeks due to some legislation being introduced around the country. And for those interested on the subject, he wrote an excellent op-ed at the National Catholic Register it was July 7th, I believe that was published. So check that out. Unfortunately, this is a continuing issue that's being pushed and legalized in various places across the nation. So we wanted to dive a little deeper on this special episode. So Nathan, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thanks, Frank. Glad to be here.
So before we go into the specific issue, if you could give us a little background on what RFI does, your involvement there, and how RFI became involved into this question of physician-assisted suicide, that would be great background.
Sure. So RFI is based in Washington, D.C., and we defend religious freedom for everyone. Not because all religions are equal in truth, but because all people are equal in dignity and have the right to seek answers to ultimate questions and to live according to what they find in that search. And they have the freedom to do that, or should have the freedom to do that, in community with others, as well as individually, and in private and public life. And so at RFI, we kind of we look at what religious freedom is. We try to explain its meaning and value with great clarity. And we try to impart that to future leaders, mostly university students in a variety of programs, including our flagship program, the Statesmanship and Religious Freedom Seminar. And we have that in multiple locations. So that's one example, equipping future leaders. It's a big part of what we do. The other part of it is equipping policymakers, parents, scholars, religious leaders, and religious institutions on the policymaker front to defend religious freedom in law and policy, and then for the others to exercise religious freedom in full. So we work in the United States. We focus on things that are happening in DC, but also in the 50 states. But we also do a lot of work abroad dealing with matters mostly of violent religious persecution. For us, we have a certain view of human dignity as being God-given, as given equally to all. And there are certain issues like physician-assisted suicide, like abortion, and others that directly implicate human dignity in such a way that we kind of weigh in directly on the matter. We think physician-assisted suicide is the kind of thing that should be prohibited in law, and is because of its morally grave nature and its the public nature of it. We also, though, on these kinds of issues, will look at conscience protections, religious freedom protections that ought to be built around them in the regrettable event that they do become legalized. And so that's kind of the way that we've started to look at the gaining momentum of physician-assisted suicide in the United States. Unfortunately, it is gaining momentum. It's something that continues to grow even to this day. And so we look with great scrutiny at some of the religious protections built into these bills and built into the laws that have already been enacted.
Yeah, this is a great point to start off on, because I've perceived a kind of a tension within the religious liberty movement on some of these issues. Because like you said, the second part, making sure that there are religious exemptions or conscience protections once these kind of regimes are in place, that's probably less controversial for religious freedom folks across the board. But I think when you're talking about advocating against particular issues that objectively violate human dignity, which I agree with, by the way, but I think there's often a tension within the movement, or even within the minds of individuals in this movement, between, on one hand, advocating against these issues that objectively violate human dignity from a religious or even just a natural law perspective. And I think physician-assisted suicide is clearly one of them. And on the other hand, the broad pluralistic advocacy for religious freedom, on the other hand, for people to be free to practice their religion. So I guess it's maybe a little far-fetched in this situation, but I mean, if there's a religious practice from a certain religion that supports suicide in certain situations, but we would say, well, the natural law, the doctrines of many religions oppose this, as opposed to, right, God and nature. How should proponents of religion, religious liberty think about this tension?
Well, I think you're right. Religious liberty proponents do, and probably more in the areas of human sexuality and marriage,
Yeah.
do they have trouble trying to figure out what positions ought we take on affirmative policies or laws that deal with marriage, deal with sexuality, deal with non-discrimination in that context, while at the same time arguing, vigorously for religious exemptions from laws that may bind, especially religious institutions that want to take or want to express in their organizational practices a contrary view. But I'll say this: religious freedom is it's a capacious right. It's a fundamental human right, but it's not unlimited. So there are boundaries. Now, how you and I might draw those boundaries based on the constitution of reality itself, natural law, and how others might draw it, that's a fair question. But at RFI, how we tend to approach this is that religious freedom is not absolute, and you know, taking innocent human life is one of those limits. So you can't, seek religious freedom's defense from an act of taking another human life or facilitating it, as in the case of physician assisted suicide. So I think there are ways simply to acknowledge that religious freedom, doesn't cover everything, and it does have outer limits, and we should take seriously what those limits are. And at RFI, we think a lot about how to kind of patrol those boundaries and think carefully about them. But when it comes to abortion, when it comes to assisted suicide, you're talking about something that is final in nature. There's no way to repair it after it's happened. And it's a pretty easy, bright line for us to draw that religious freedom would never provide a refuge for those kinds of things.
Well, I appreciate the courage and the clarity to draw those bright lines, especially on issues this important. So I would love to go down a rabbit hole and spend the rest of this conversation on that. But let's dive
Sure.
into the actual physician-assisted suicide movement and hone in a little bit. So this movement, it's called different things, right? Medical aid in dying, death with dignity, or nice euphemisms that have been invented in the last few decades. And I guess this got started in the 90s, right? There was an Oregon law, there was the Glucksberg case that did not create a right to assisted suicide in the Constitution, but that's been going on now for 30 plus years. So what does the landscape look like today? Like what happened from the 90s to today?
Yeah, so Oregon enacted the nation's first physician assisted suicide law. So it legalized the practice in 1994. I guess for administrative reasons, it did not take effect until 97. And then there was a bit of a break. And I believe it was in 2008, the state of Washington enacted a similar law. And then since that time, another 9 states have been added. The most recent was in May, and it was the state of Delaware. So now we have 11 states authorize it in within their jurisdiction, and Washington D.C. does as well. Another 17 states just this year have bills introduced in their state houses that would legalize physician-assisted suicide. So that's kind of the state of play at this point. The difference between the US and Canada and some other countries on this is that no state in the US allows or legalizes euthanasia along with assisted suicide. They're only doing the latter, physician assisted suicide. So that's an interesting distinction. I think morally, of course, the two practices are deeply, connected or very close in nature. They're obviously identical in effect, but there is a distinction between authorizing someone to take an innocent human life versus authorizing them to kind of be a party to it, but then the person commits suicide themselves. So anyway, for whatever that's worth, that's what's happening. But 17 states right now have introduced legislation on this issue. Most of the states that have enacted it are out west or in the Northeast.
Mhm.
Among though the 17 states that have introduced it, I think Tennessee, Florida, Virginia, there are some states in the South. So as of now, though, no states in the Midwest or the South have these laws on the books. But there are, proposals in some of these states, though, where regions of the country where there's not been any legalization of this in the past.
Okay. Now I know we're recording on July 17th. So as of today, has the governor of New York signed their bill? Because that one got a lot of media attention. I know it was on her desk as of a week ago.
Sure. As far as I know, that has not happened. So Governor Hochul is still considering the bill. I think she is expected to support it and ultimately sign it. But hopefully she's still mulling it over and considering the full implications of it, and will decide to veto. But I don't think that's considered to be likely.
Now, before we move on, I'm just curious because I like to track legislative patterns, right? Like we follow the Religious Liberty Restoration Act movement in the States, which had an interesting similar trajectory of big push in the early 2000, late 90s, early 2000s, then it stopped, and now it's resurged the last couple of years. So this one's pretty staggering. Like you said, after a 14-year gap, you have a second state, and then, 30 years later, you have 11, 12 jurisdictions, and then 17 more introduced this year. So any sense of what's going on? Because that doesn't seem organic for it to more than double in 1 year all of a sudden.
Sure. I don't know all the factors at play. I mean, there's a website called Death with Dignity. That's the name of the first bill that was in the state of Oregon, and many other states I think have adopted it as well. And obviously, death with dignity. I mean, who could be against that when you frame it that way? And unfortunately, it just entirely obscures the reality of the situation. But there, if you look at a lot of the provisions in these bills, clearly there's model legislation behind it that is getting advanced in many different states simultaneously. I assume that's what's happening. In the country of Canada in 2016, Canada legalized euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. So I think for the last number of years in Western countries and including North America, there has been a certain vision, and this is played out in the area of human sexuality and gender and elsewhere. There's been a view of radical individual autonomy, which has really taken hold. Autonomy is the highest good. And I think you might be able to view this as simply an extension of that understanding of the human person. So I'm sure there are much more proximate sort of propellants to this that I'm missing. But I think that has been growing in its, kind of effects on our society for a long time. And maybe we're reaching a point where in this area of physician-assisted suicide, that principle is finally playing itself out more fully.
Yeah, that makes sense. The autonomy focused policy initiatives would lead here. I think that's compelling.
Because you even hear bodily autonomy arguments
Yeah.
in various forms that have been floated and of course have been proclaimed in the abortion context are now taking in various forms taking hold here as well.
Yeah.
And if you understand individual choice to be an intrinsic good, okay, then you're going to have a harder time arguing against assisted suicide because someone wants to be able to die on their own terms. That's how it's often put. And if that's the case, and you think this is the highest good, autonomy, then you're going to have a hard time building a hedge against it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the themes that we come back to a lot on this podcast is how the usually opponents of religion and religious liberty in the policy space often start with these very euphemistic and also permissive sounding. We just want the right to do X, but permission quickly becomes compulsion, and I think it's pretty obvious here because people wanting bodily autonomy to end their own life on their own terms. I mean, I don't want to be macabre, but everybody has the ability, no matter what the law says, to kill themselves if they want, right? Like you can, again, don't want to be too vulgar, but you can jump off a bridge, you can crash a car, you have a gun. It's not, but what this is doing is compelling the medical industry to be a part of it. So this is not just about someone's right; it's about forcing entire industries and people to cooperate with it. So that's something more than individual autonomy.
You're totally right, though, that because of the nature of suicide, as tragic and lamentable as it is, someone doesn't need the state's permission to do it.
Right.
But the state does have a choice on whether to license it, okay, the way you're describing, and whether to redefine the practice itself as a form of medicine.
Yes.
There's a way the law teaches. You're well formed in a tradition that understands that acutely. The law teaches here that medicine, which restores, repairs, heals, or at least mitigates suffering, you're saying that assisted suicide is a kind of thing that fits in that category when it's anti-medicine. Yes. And so the state sending this message to its citizens is is wrong.
Yeah.
Bottom line. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a good friend who's a doctor, a Catholic doctor involved in the Catholic Medical Association. I had asked him the other day, I was like, I know that you don't mostly use the traditional Hippocratic oath, but isn't the primary principle to do no harm? And it's like, I don't even want to tell you what percentage of doctors are in direct violation of that because of the practices that have been
Mm,
accepted, to your point, as medicine, right? Abortion and euthanasia or assisted suicide among them. Um,
yeah.
so you mentioned a couple times Canada, and I know Canada's euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide regimes have made some headlines in the last decade or so as being pretty extreme. So anything you think is instructive or worth knowing about what's happened in Canada and what we might learn from that?
Yeah, I do think it's instructive. In 2016, Canada legalized medical aid in dying, the euphemism they use for it. And it covered both, it authorized both physician assisted suicide and euthanasia. Though the vast, vast, vast majority of people who seek out medical aid in dying there are are pursuing euthanasia and not assisted suicide, which I don't know how to explain that, but that is empirically what's happening. In 2016, about 1,000 people died from euthanasia in Canada. By by 2023, that number had gone above, had surged past 15,000. So when you look at what has happened in a society that's redefined medical aid in dying as a form of medicine, redefine getting help with killing yourself as a form of medicine. I mean, the numbers are staggering. And so the law has taught something in Canada, and that's mostly what I take away from it. That should be a real alarm bell for the United States to think about, that this is what's happened. 1,000 people, and then a few years later, 15,000 people. And I believe now it's the fourth or fifth leading cause of death in Canada. Euthanasia is. And
Wow.
so that's staggering.
Lord have mercy. It's so troubling. And to your original point about before, now we'll turn to conscience protections in a moment, but I think just
Yeah.
the human dignity issue here is so important. The how this practice, at least in my view, just degrades the human dignity of everyone involved, right? The sick and the suffering individuals, you're telling them, your suffering has no dignity, and you have this option that, by the way, is less burdensome on the people around you to end your life rather than to suffer with dignity. So I think calling it death with dignity is really tragically ironic. I mean,
Yeah.
the dignity of doctors being degraded by asking them to assist in killing patients rather than healing them. And then the dignity of the family members and the loved ones of these people who are encouraged to see this as a legitimate option rather than to accompany their loved ones, in their last years, weeks, days, but rather to let them just do this to themselves. It's just, I don't know, that's not an articulate question for you, but it's such a tragedy on every level and such an affront to human dignity.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I want to acknowledge Cardinal Dolan wrote about the New York bill in
Mhm.
First Things back in May. I think it was in May. And he acknowledged that proponents of this movement, of the death with dignity movement, are motivated by wanting to alleviate suffering. So I think we can acknowledge that. It's just that their remedy is abhorrent. I mean, what they're proposing that people do is opening themselves and encouraging their family members to come along and accompany them, as you described, in ignoring the sanctity of their own lives. And
Yeah.
they're human beings. They bear a dignity equal to all others that has its ultimate source in God Himself. And you know, pursuing suicide is something that's inherently violative of that dignity. And for the state to say, yeah, this is a valid option, is something that one, we at RFI totally oppose. Um, but it's also something that's signaling to people all across the country that this is something that's okay, and it's quite the opposite.
Yeah. Well, this was a really helpful framework on the baseline issue. So I'd like to turn to conscience concerns, protections. What are once these regimes are in place, where is RFI's interest, and where should the religious liberty movement be concerned with how to
Mhm.
ensure, religious and conscience protections for the medical professionals and in general?
Yeah. There's some variation in religious exemptions that are built into the bill, or conscience protections, whatever language you want to use, for those who refuse. So it's either, there's no duty to prescribe these lethal doses, lethal substances, or a right to refuse. So those are kind of the two different ways that these protections are partially built into these laws. However, and I looked at Colorado's law. I looked at New York's bill in depth. So there is some variation, but I think there is also some commonalities across the many laws that legalize physician-assisted suicide. And a lot of it has to do with this point of refusal and what the obligations are of either the refusing institution, whether it's a Catholic hospital or something like that, or practitioner. What then do they have to do as the patient wants to transfer to another institution or to another practitioner? And one thing that is most concerning is the ambiguity the laws leave in place. And that ambiguity opens the door for either, adverse administrative action by a government entity or litigation, which, you at Napa Legal know a lot about. So the reality is, in the New York bill, for example, there's a transfer requirement that the transfer is mandatory. So a facility refuses to allow physician-assisted suicide on its premises. It's got a patient that wants to seek it out. And if the bill goes into effect, there is a transfer mandate on that facility. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't make clear whether the mandate to transfer to the patient to a facility that will allow them to pursue assisted suicide, it's not clear whether they have to arrange the transportation. Do they have to fund the transportation? Are there other logistics that they have to arrange in order to make this happen? And there are degrees of moral complicity here when you spin a chain of action into motion as an institution or as a practitioner that then implicates you in the end goal, which is to commit suicide. And so that transfer, and people might bristle against this in some quarters, but they really need to take seriously the dire nature of physician-assisted suicide. Means that any degree of participation in it is a grave moral matter for a lot of people, especially Catholics and other Christians. But there are a lot of people that don't want to be implicated at all. And yet this transfer mandate is one way. The ambiguity around it in New York's bill and in other laws, it's unclear. It's unclear what the requirement is. And when that gets sorted out in a court of law, I'm not entirely sure that it's going to go the right way. So that's one area. Another area involves employment at a private facility, a private hospital, for instance, and whether a doctor who refuses, to participate, who refuses to prescribe medication for someone that is seeking to commit suicide, are they open to adverse employment action on part of their hospital? It's not clear in New York's bill. So this is another area where the legislators there could have closed the gap on that, and they chose not to. And again, it's the nature of physician-assisted suicide. It's how grave it is morally. That means you need to make these conscience protections abundantly clear with bright lines, drawn around them.
Now, are there, I don't want to say better exemptions or better law. I mean, I suppose they'd be better exemptions, but less bad laws. Are there states that have these physician-assisted suicide regimes that have clear, objecting institutions or individuals can completely opt out of referrals, transportation, all of that?
So one, I haven't examined all the state laws in all the 11 states, so I can't speak to it directly. I mean, I think there are ones that are better and worse, and I think over time the exemptions have gotten stronger. If you look back at the state of affairs in 1994 when Oregon passed its law, in part, I think just they hadn't run the traps on everything that might happen in these moments of transition when a patient might leave. And probably there were things in that bill that people learned. They learned how to make them less concerning to religious communities. But by and large, I think many of these vulnerabilities are at play in most of the other states. And in talking to a colleague at the Christian Medical and Dental Association who looks at these things in depth, he advised that oftentimes, even when there are good exemptions in place, they get weakened over time, not strengthened, due
Yeah.
to what happens in courts. And so, I mean, for that reason, and that organization also opposes these laws outright. But when they are not explicitly protecting every dimension of what happens in this context for both hospitals and individual practitioners, it inevitably gets taken advantage of by proponents of the other side.
Yeah. Now, I'm no expert in this area of healthcare law, but aren't there are some federal medical conscience laws, like the Church amendments and some other things that should, I don't know how the preemption works here, but where there are some protections for medical professionals' conscience and religious convictions. Are those in play in contrast to these state
Sure.
laws?
Yeah, and let me give you my typical caveat that I'm not a lawyer, so I
Yeah,
want to I'm not offering any legal advice at all. But
yeah,
the Church Amendment, of course, is important. It involves explicitly abortion and sterilization practices, and basically says that if you're an entity, a hospital that receives federal funding, you cannot discriminate against practitioners who are unwilling to participate in abortion or sterilization procedures. So now there are other areas of federal law that do that involve religious freedom that would protect, but after years probably of running it up the chain through the state courts and then jumping over possibly to the federal court system. So it is the case. I mean, perhaps maybe even a RFRA claim, or with what's happening now with Smith jurisprudence and claims around the First Amendment when it comes to neutral, generally applicable rules. So there are changes. So I'm not saying there aren't other protections at the federal level, but there's a lot of punishment in the process. And so a lot of hospitals and individual practitioners would be dragged through years of litigation before they would get a favorable remedy, if relying on what protections are available at the federal level.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a really important point to make, because we often get this in other contexts where we advocate for particular exemptions from, non-discrimination laws in employment or public accommodations, and people will respond, well, I mean, your state has a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Like, right, but we'd rather have the exemption on the front end so we don't have to go to court to figure out whether we're allowed to live in accordance with our religious principles. So
Right.
yes,
Well, and the
completely.
reality is a lot of, administrators in state agencies who might enforce these laws, or legislators, they ought to be proactively taking into account their state RFRA when they administer, or when they legislate, or when they administer these laws. And as you know, they don't always do that. They don't often do that. And
Yeah.
so then you rely on the courts as a backstop, and then it takes just a lot of time. And that's understandable. I mean, to get through a proper judicial process, I get that it takes a lot of time. But even if you get a favorable outcome, as you indicated, you're still it's going to take a lot of time, and and sometimes a lot of money, and otherwise a lot of pain along the way to get there.
Yeah. Now, you may have just mentioned this, or you may have said it, given it to me off camera, but there's one more conscience concern about having to lie about the cause of death in these kinds of cases. I think
Yes,
it's in the
thank
New
you for
York
bringing that up.
legislation. Yeah, I'd love to
I
hear
had
about
missed
that.
in my initial look at the New York bill. And by the way, this is a provision that I've found in multiple other states, so it's not just New York's proposal. But Cardinal Dolan also wrote, he mentioned this obligation to lie on death certificates.
Mm.
Basically, what these laws require, and what the New York bill certainly requires, is that the cause of death must be recorded as the underlying terminal illness that was identified in part of the elements of making it lawful to prescribe the lethal dose in the first place, in the context of physician assisted suicide. And so you are not able, as the physician involved, to basically indicate what actually happened. Now, this is an example of compelled lying. I don't know what else you would call it. One of my questions, and I actually have somebody looking into this because I'm curious about it, is whether there are other medical professionals or administrative professionals that work in hospitals that then become implicated in this misrepresentation of what happened. this is a secondary issue compared to the other things we've discussed.
Sure.
But I don't think a state mandate to misrepresent the truth is something that we should just sort of, brush away as being no big deal. I think it is a big deal.
Yeah, no, that's a huge point, both for, I mean, the obvious conscience protection of not forcing people to lie, which is always a grave
Yeah.
constitutional and moral matter. But also this would be a huge problem for tracking the extent of this stuff, right? I would assume that if they're not putting the cause of death honestly, then it's gonna be much harder to track how many people are actually engaging in physician-assisted suicide.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's another issue that I have not really pinpointed. In Canada, somehow, I see very specific numbers around euthanasia.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how are they recording this? Do they have the same requirement to not, signal what really happened when they do their death certificates? But here in the U.S., I don't know how you would do it unless
Yeah.
there's a secondary, some kind of secondary record keeping that indicates that this process was also at play.
Yeah, something I would definitely like to know more about and
Yeah,
hear.
no, it is. But I just want to say one more thing on it. I mean, it says something that the actual cause of death must be obscured in these cases. It's almost like an admission by the legislatures that something is at play here that we don't fully want to, enshrine or acknowledge. I just find it interesting that's some kind of admission that they recognize it's not quite right. Something's amiss.
That's a great point because the messaging around this is that this is a good thing for the dignity of people dying and bodily autonomy and all this. But if it were really just an unobjectionable good thing and everybody agreed on that, you wouldn't try to hide when people are using
Absolutely.
it. That's a
Yes,
great point.
that's better said. That's precisely my point. Yeah.
This is, I mean, fascinating in a very disturbing sense, but this has been really enlightening. Um, I guess as we wrap up, are there any final thoughts on the religious freedom movement, the protections, the next steps? Like, how would you like to kind of wrap up on this issue?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think as I would encourage those who are watching and monitoring the other bills, the other 16 bills that are live right now, because I think New York is one of the 17 that I mentioned.
Yeah.
Look specifically at these areas and see if there are ways, one, oppose the bills directly. But as you're sort of regrettably looking at secondary factors, look and see whether the exemptions that I mentioned around patient referrals and transfers, around protections from employment consequences, are these things in there? See if the mandated deception is in there about the cause of death. And I think that, remedying those problems does have value, even while we oppose the bills themselves. So I would encourage, those who are active, various groups that are active in certain state legislatures who are doing advocacy in these areas, try to see if there are ways to strengthen those and to make sure that individual legislators, maybe committee chairs and others that have lots of responsibilities around these bills moving forward, fully understand them. And then if they do get passed by the state houses, that maybe the governor is fully aware that these weaknesses are still there. Maybe it's enough to cause him or her to take a turn on it or demand that these changes be made before they sign them into law.
I think that's a great point to end on. I think this is a good message for people in the religious liberty or movement or in these kind of culture war issues in general that a lot of these issues are at a fundamental level such an affront to human dignity, physician assisted suicide and abortion primary among them. But even those of us who are principled abolitionists on these issues, right, need to be incrementalists in terms of getting victories where we can, right? If you can't stop a bill, making it less bad, making the conscience protections here better is a win and is an important thing to do. All or nothing is not a very smart political strategy.
That's right. And if there are ways to advocate for this incremental approach while maintaining your integrity and opposing the bills, and I think there are creative ways to do that, then I say rush headlong into it and do it.
Yeah, I agree. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for joining us, helping our listeners to understand this issue. I think both the affront to human dignity of physician-assisted suicide in general, but also the robust need for conscience protections in the areas you mentioned. This is a really important battle and something of interest for the religious liberty movement. So thank you so much for taking the time to explain this.
Thanks for having me. It was great to be here.
And for our listeners, thank you as always for joining us for this episode of the Napa Legal Podcast. If you enjoy the content we're putting out, we always appreciate if you like the podcast, subscribe on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you are listening from. So we hope you'll join us next week as we continue to highlight and discuss some of these most important issues that affect religious liberty and the work of faith-based nonprofit organizations. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you for joining us, and God bless you.